the Russians, who tried to replace their own Soviet-era naval surveillance satellite system with new constellations of Pion and Lotos electronic intelligence and electro-optical satellites, had by the early 2020s only launched one electronic intelligence satellite and about 6 electro-optical ones. And Russia is itself a great military power.
The death of the battleship came with the emergence of the aircraft carrier and a change in the nature of sea battle to one that was conducted over greater range. But in the Cold War, the Soviets very obviously did not seek to go toe-to-toe against the US as they developed these enormous fleet carriers. So, Siddharth, am I right in saying, as I said in the introduction, that carriers have always been the hallmark of superpowers?
Yeah, and to a certain extent, although you're right that the Soviets didn't ever seek to replicate, the U.S. carrier capability, their sort of commander for the head of the Soviet Navy for much of the Cold War, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, consistently pushed for them to be able to do so because, they recognized after the Cuban Missile Crisis and really quite early on in the Cold War that the Cold War was probably not going to be fought in Europe. It wasn't going to be fought in the Fulda Gap because the risks were just too big for both superpowers. It was going to be fought at expeditionary reach. And really, in that context, naval power, and in particular, the ability to generate local air power at close proximity was something that Gorshkov regarded, correctly in my view, as critical. They did develop sort of light fleet carriers, the Kuznetsov class, but they never really got what the Soviet Navy never really got what it wanted. And that, of course, reflected the fact that it was subordinate to a army-dominated general staff. But you're right. I think it always has been the hallmark of being a global superpower rather than a regional power, which is something, even the Soviet navalists would have probably seen.
And it's been interesting that as Putin has sought to modernize the Russian military over the last 20 years, one of the areas he definitely did not seek to modernize was the aircraft carriers. Indeed, Jerry, I think when you were fleet commander, I remember the Russian carrier was making its way down the channel, belching black smoke. And you discussed with me whether or not we were going to send out a warship as an escort or a tug to assist in case it broke down. So Putin's lack of investment notwithstanding, you would argue, I'm certain, that carriers remain essential to any modern blue water navy.
Yes, absolutely, James, and many thanks for allowing me to join in this discussion today. Listen, Steve's right. The Russian Navy has been very centric on submarine, particularly nuclear submarine powers, and their confrontation with the West was always really underwater in the Atlantic, as I know very well. But in recent times, the Russians have become much more ambitious in the global stage, and their ambitions are now in Africa and the Far East, the Arctic, and increasingly in the Pacific. So, the aircraft carrier capability for them is deeply attractive, if at the moment too expensive, because the Russians have watched. They've recognized that having an aircraft carrier allows you to power project on the global stage like no other military asset. At the end of the day, is the capacity to deploy and sustain combat power globally is where aircraft carriers are at their zenith. And quite frankly, any navy worth its salt has at its heart, as its centerpiece, an aircraft carrier capability. And that is why so many countries remain invested in them and will continue to do so into the future.
So for viewers who haven't recognized you from the documentary that you starred in when you brought HMS Queen Elizabeth out of build, you drove a carrier twice. You drove the last of the Royal Navy's light carriers, and then you brought the first of the Queen Elizabeth class out of build. Can you just explain to our viewers what role it is that carriers play in the sea battle? Why are they so essential to achieving sea control in the modern maritime environment?
Yes, indeed. I actually commanded 2 strike carriers and also HMS Illustrious in the rotary wing helicopter role. So I've commanded carriers with different mixed air wings. But central is the aircraft carrier is not to be seen as just a ship. That's completely wrong. An aircraft carrier, particularly in the modern sense, yes, it delivers air power, and that's its fundamental job really is delivering striking power to strike targets ashore at range and of course at sea. But now we're evolving the aircraft carrier very quickly. They are a joint operating base laden with all sorts of capabilities, not just military, also intelligence services, special forces. So because they are sovereign capability and they can be deployed around the world with impunity largely, they can be loaded with capabilities that really can't be hosted by any other platform. So carriers will remain, if you like, the mothership of ambitious navies because they are so flexible and the fact they are sovereign and they are not just a moving airfield, although that's a primary role. So I think what we'll see moving forward is the aircraft carrier, largely physically remaining the same, a flat deck. It moves through the water at speed, but what's in it that's the key thing.
So it's the threat is changing. I mean, the satellite surveillance is now all pervasive, so hiding these things ever harder. The Chinese are investing an enormous amount of money in hypersonic precision missiles that will contribute to an anti-access area denial capability. So Jerry's made the point very powerfully that these ships remain the sort of the foundation stone of any credible modern blue water navy. But that can't be forever. There's too much investment going into being able to defeat carriers.
Yeah. So my first observation there is that you're right. The Chinese have invested in a quite formidable anti-access area denial threat in the Asia-Pacific. And there is a sort of cost imbalance facing the carrier and its defenses in that, an anti-ship ballistic missile like the 1,500-kilometer DF-21D costs in the range of 10 million and can potentially, if it strikes a carrier, mission kill it. But I think there's a risk of drawing the wrong lesson from that therefore these relative sort of cost asymmetries mean that weaker actors will be able to asymmetrically offset carriers in general. What you need to look at the DF-21D and the DF-17, the hypersonic glide vehicle, as is part of a system for the Chinese, a system that includes 300 surveillance satellites, both electronic intelligence and synthetic aperture radar, which includes automated processing that allows for countermeasures against these satellites like spoofing and barrage jamming to be overcome, which includes the ability to coordinate other ISR methods like aircraft and vessels and fuse the data from them. And when you look at the costs of that system in aggregate rather than the missile itself, you realize that if anything, building that kind of system is even more of an exclusive superpower prerogative than building an aircraft carrier. It's really only the Chinese and the Americans who could potentially do something like that. So my first observation is, I think that case is relevant to the Pacific, but not necessarily transferable. Just to give you an example, the Russians who tried to replace their own Soviet-era naval surveillance satellite system with new constellations of Pion and Lotos electronic intelligence and electro-optical satellites had, by the early 2020s, only launched one electronic intelligence satellite and about 6 electro-optical ones. And Russia is itself a great military power. So I'd say the barriers to entry kind of preclude most states denying sea space to the aircraft carrier in the way that the Chinese can. The second point I'd make, though, is even within the specific confines of the Pacific, when we talk about the vulnerability of the carrier, we do have to ask the question relative to what. There are undoubtedly very real risks to the aircraft carrier, but there are exponentially greater risks to Cadena, which is, the main US air base in the region, which is within range of the vast majority of much cheaper short-range ballistic missiles, with which the Chinese could overwhelm them. And similarly, if you look at even greater distances at Guam, one expert suggested that the cost of air and missile defense for Guam alone would cost around $5 billion, and even that would provide a temporary air defense bubble. So as much of a risk as there is to carriers, even in the Pacific, there's still probably a safer sort of platform for projecting air power than fixed air bases, which are eminently more vulnerable. Beyond the Pacific, as I said, that risk out to 1,500 or 2,000 kilometers, I suspect won't exist, or to the extent that it does, it will come from platforms like nuclear attack submarines, which are themselves expensive, valuable, and which an adversary will be loath to risk unless there's a high probability of success. But it is true, that cruise missiles are proliferating. We've seen, the Houthis, who a non-state actor, field them in the Red Sea in a way that would have been inconceivable 20 years ago. The quality of Russian coastal defense batteries, like the P8, like the Bastion P, also represent a step change over Cold War or sort of predecessors. And so certainly the way in which carriers operate even outside the Pacific will change somewhat. I don't expect that what we saw in 1991, where carriers loitered in the Persian Gulf relatively close to the theater of operations to support air operations ashore, would be possible. I think there is a threat out from say 300 to 500 kilometers, even if you're not in the Pacific. But really, the robust anti-access area denial challenge, that issue of pervasive ISR, and really and effectors which have a high probability of penetrating a carrier screen, is a very regionally specific one because of those barriers to entry. It's something I'd like.
It's fascinating. Jerry, a theme that's emerged from our last couple of discussions on superpowers has been the divergence between the Euro-Atlantic theatre and the Indo-Pacific theatre. And I remember, when you were the fleet commander, the Carrier Strike Group deployed in 2021 to the Indo-Pacific and had an amazing trip and demonstrated its convening power as allies around the region came out to operate with us. But there is no doubt, exactly as just been so well set out, that the A2AD battle in the Pacific very different to the one in the Atlantic. And you can see the Queen Elizabeth class with fifth generation fighters on board posing a threat to the Kola Peninsula in the high north as a very credible challenge. But there are models that suggest that no carrier is making it across the Indian Ocean if it's on its way to fight China. So is it worth having simply for the Euro-Atlantic, or do you reject that they're being increasingly overmatched by defences in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, and I like to agree with all the points just made by my colleague. Absolutely right between the regional aspects there. No, I refute that. I think the whole beauty of an aircraft carrier is it is not in the sense purely regional capability. I think the whole point of them is having a global flexibility to it. We have modelled, as you can imagine, every theatre to death. With aircraft carriers, carrier strike battle groups, and there's a whole number of plans, operational plans, that are designed obviously with the threat and the enemy's or potential enemy's capabilities in mind. Particularly in the PACOM area, we've worked very closely, of course, with the American Navy on this, with all the contingency, particularly around Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait, and Southeast Asia. And of course, operational design for those contingency plans does take all this into account. There are a different suite of challenges, of course, in each region, and I agree with my colleague, that the suite you find in the Baltic or the high north, the Atlantic, is very different to the very concentrated, very high threat area of Southeast Asia. And I think the carrier battle groups play a different role. I wouldn't like to go into the particular specifics for security reasons, but the sophistication of approach, particularly by allies with carriers, is extremely good. And I would just push back that the sort of cliche that that carriers are vulnerable is absolutely wrong. There is probably no safer military asset to base your air power on than an aircraft carrier at sea. The very basic issues of the difficulty in targeting a ship, even in the vastness of the Atlantic and also the Western Pacific, is considerable, and they move. I think people forget the very basics, that a fixed airfield ashore can be targeted because it doesn't go anywhere and it's very large. Not only does the aircraft carrier group move, but the defensive shields around it, both from cyber, from space, from the anti-missile capability you take in your frigates and your destroyers, the up-threat protection afforded by nuclear submarines and special forces, allows you to shape any battle space commensurate with the risk you're going to find there. So the sophistication of the modern battle space is significant, and we do understand the enemy's capabilities very well indeed, I have to say. So, as always, it's a very, very complicated cake, and the ingredients of which are getting ever more complicated. But for my money, as an aircraft carrier officer, they still remain a centerpiece, a very sound investment in order to deliver power projection at range in a sustainable manner.